Stop the wedding. The maid tore the bride's dress. The billionaire couldn't believe why. Stop the wedding. The maid's voice cracked through the ballroom like glass breaking on marble, and 200 guests turned as one toward the woman standing at the end of the aisle, both hands fisted in white silk. Priya didn't remember crossing the room. She only remembered the sound the dress made when it tore, a long, ugly rip that silenced the string quartet mid-note, and the look on Adrian Cole's face when he saw what she was holding underneath the torn fabric, pressed flat against the bride's stomach, taped there like something that needed hiding. A folded piece of paper. Adrian didn't move. 34 years old, a man who had closed 9-figure deals without blinking. And in that moment he simply stood there in his tuxedo at the altar of his own wedding, staring at the maid who had worked in his house for 3 years, waiting for her to explain why she had just destroyed a $40,000 dress in front of everyone he had ever done business with. "Priya," he said quietly. "What is this?" She didn't answer him. She looked past him at the bride, at Celine, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloths, and Priya said the only thing she'd come there to say. "Ask her why she needed a copy of your father's will taped to her body on your wedding day." Before Adrian's story reached this room, before Celine ever put on that dress, there was a different morning, 3 years earlier, when a 26-year-old woman named Priya Bundari walked into the Cole estate for a housekeeping interview she almost didn't take, because the pay was good but something about the silence in that enormous house made her uneasy. She took the job anyway, because her mother's medical bills didn't care about uneasy feelings. And you're here with us tonight because we believe stories like Priya's, stories about the people who see everything and are asked to say nothing, deserve to be told all the way to the end. If that's the kind of story that keeps you watching until the truth finally comes out, we'd love for you to subscribe and stay with us. Now let's go back to where it started, in a house too big for the one man who lived in it. The Cole estate sat on 11 acres outside the city, a house built by Adrian's father, Walter Cole, before Walter Cole made himself a name that appeared in industry magazines and, eventually, in a smaller and sadder headline about a heart attack at 61. Adrian inherited the company at 28, the house at the same time, and a grief he never talked about with anyone, least of all himself. He filled the silence with work. He was the kind of wealthy man who forgot to eat unless someone reminded him, who kept his father's reading glasses on the nightstand in the room he never slept in, who paid people well and looked at them rarely. Priya noticed things other people didn't bother to notice. She noticed that Adrian ironed his own shirts on Sunday nights even though she offered every week to do it for him, because it was, she came to understand, the 1 hour he allowed himself to think about his father without an audience. She noticed he always left the porch light on, even in daylight, because his mother had told him once before she passed that a house with a light on never truly felt empty. She never mentioned these things to him. She simply worked and watched, and kept the house running the way a person keeps a candle from going out, quietly without asking for credit. It was Priya who found Walter Cole's old study untouched behind a locked door on the 2nd floor, 3 months into the job, when Adrian finally asked her to clean it because he could no longer bring himself to go in there alone. Papers stacked the way Walter had left them the week he died. A framed photograph of Adrian at 9 years old, gap-toothed, holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. A leather folder Priya was told never to open, and never did, though she dusted around its edges every week for years and wondered, the way anyone would wonder, what was inside something a dying man had wanted kept closed. She wasn't the only person in that house who wondered. Celine Marsh came into Adrian's life the way expensive things arrive in the lives of busy men, through someone else's introduction at a charity gala, wearing the kind of confidence that reads as warmth until you've watched it long enough to see the calculation underneath. She was 30, polished, quick with a compliment, quicker with a laugh that landed exactly when it needed to. Adrian, who had spent 6 years since his father's death mostly alone, found in her something he hadn't let himself want. Someone who seemed to see him, not his company, not his house, not the number after his name. Priya watched the courtship happen the way she watched everything, from the edges of rooms, refilling water glasses, and she noticed the first thing that didn't sit right within a month. Celine asked questions. Not about Adrian, about the estate. About the study on the second floor. About whether Walter Cole had left anything unusual in his final arrangements. She asked it lightly, the way people ask about weather, but she asked it more than once, to more than one person, and always when she thought no one who mattered was listening. Priya mattered so little to Celine that she never noticed being overheard. By the 6-month mark, Celine had a key to the house. By the 10-month mark, she had opinions about which staff should stay and which should be, in her words to the estate manager, restructured for efficiency. Priya kept her head down. She needed the job. But she began, without deciding to, paying closer attention to the woman who was going to become the lady of a house that had never quite recovered from losing its last one. The proposal happened at Christmas, in front of family friends. Exactly the kind of public moment that leaves no graceful way to say anything but yes. Adrian dropped to one knee in the same room where his father used to read the paper every Sunday morning, and Priya, setting down a tray of drinks near the doorway, watched Celine's face in the half-second before she composed it into joy. It wasn't love that crossed her features first. It was relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting for a door to finally open. Priya told herself it meant nothing. People got nervous at proposals. She had no proof of anything, only a feeling, and feelings didn't hold up to scrutiny in a house where she was, ultimately, staff, and Celine was, as of that night, family. The wedding planning consumed the following year, and Priya watched Celine grow more comfortable, more entitled, more willing to speak to the household staff the way you speak to furniture that occasionally needs adjusting. She was cold to Priya in particular, in the specific way people are cold to someone they suspect might be paying closer attention than they'd like. Twice, Priya caught Celine coming out of the second-floor study when Adrian was traveling for work, a room Celine had no reason to enter, a room even Adrian rarely opened. Both times, Celine offered an explanation so smooth it almost worked. Looking for a book. Checking on a leak the contractor mentioned. There was no leak. Priya had spoken to the contractor herself the week before. The first real clue arrived 4 months before the wedding, on an ordinary Tuesday, when Priya was cleaning the study and found the locked drawer of Walter Cole's desk sitting slightly open. Not broken, not forced, just open in a way it had never been open in 3 years of Sundays spent dusting that same room. Inside, where the leather folder had always sat untouched, there was a gap. Not empty. Rearranged. As though someone had taken something out, looked at it, and put it back not quite where it belonged. Priya said nothing to Adrian. What would she say? That a drawer looked different. He was 3 weeks from marrying a woman he believed loved him, and Priya was a maid with no evidence and every reason to keep quiet if she valued her paycheck. She put the folder back exactly where she remembered it sitting and told herself to stop imagining things. She might have succeeded, if not for the phone call she overheard 2 weeks later, carrying fresh towels down the hallway outside the guest suite where Celine had taken to sleeping in the final stretch before the wedding, supposedly to preserve tradition. Celine's voice, low, tight with something that wasn't romance. I told you it changes everything if it's real. I need to know before Saturday, not after. Was. Then sharper. No, if his father actually put that in writing, I need to see it before I sign anything that locks me into the current structure. Just get me a copy. I don't care how. Priya stood very still in the hallway, towels pressed against her chest, and did not breathe until the door across from her opened, and she had to pretend she'd only just arrived. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know what Walter Cole might have written that a woman would need to see before her own wedding, badly enough to risk stealing into a locked study for it. But she knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 3 years learning the rhythms of a house, that whatever it was, it mattered more to Celine than the man she was about to marry. Priya tried once to say something. She found Adrian alone in his study late one night, 2 weeks before the wedding, going through old boxes of his father's things the way he did every year around the anniversary of Walter's death, and she almost told him everything. The drawer, the phone call, 3 years of small, unexplainable moments that added up to a feeling she couldn't prove. But Adrian looked up at her with an exhaustion so deep it seemed to live in his bones, and said without her prompting anything, "I miss him more the closer this wedding gets. Isn't that strange? I thought I'd feel less alone." And Priya, looking at a grieving man who had finally let himself hope for a family again, could not bring herself to hand him a suspicion with no proof attached. She said good night instead. She told herself she would find the proof first, and then she would speak. She didn't know yet that she was running out of time to do either. The days that followed moved the way the final days before a wedding always move. Too fast and somehow also unbearably slow. A house filling with flowers and delivery trucks and 100 small emergencies that had nothing to do with the one Priya was quietly trying to solve. She found herself watching Celine with an intensity that felt, at times, like it might give her away. She catalogued every unguarded moment. A call cut short when Priya entered a room. A folder of papers Celine kept in a locked box in her suite, a box Priya had never seen before that year. A box Celine guarded the way people guard things they're afraid will be taken from them, not things they're proud to own. 5 days before the wedding, Priya finally got her chance, and she almost didn't take it. Celine had gone to a final dress fitting, taking most of the afternoon, and the house was quiet in the particular way it only was when its newest resident wasn't in it. Priya told herself she was only going in to change the linens. She told herself that all the way up the stairs, all the way to the guest suite, all the way to the locked box sitting exactly where it always sat, on the shelf of the closet behind a row of shoeboxes. It wasn't locked that day. Celine, in her rush to the fitting, had left it open. Priya knew, opening it, that she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. If she was wrong, if this was nothing, she had just violated the privacy of the woman about to become her employer's wife, and there would be no coming back from that. But if she was right. Inside were photographs, bank statements Priya didn't understand well enough to interpret, and a single folded document, the paper old and slightly yellowed, a photocopy of something clearly much older than the wedding it had found its way into. Priya unfolded it with hands that weren't quite steady, and read 3 lines before she heard a car in the driveway and had to fold it back exactly as she'd found it, heart slamming, certain she'd been caught. She hadn't been caught, but she had seen enough. Enough to know that the document was a photocopy of an amendment to Walter Cole's estate, dated less than a year before he died, and that it named, alongside Adrian, a second beneficiary Priya had never heard mentioned in 3 years in that house. Someone identified only by initials, someone the original will apparently did not name at all. She didn't understand what it meant. She only understood that Celine had gone to considerable trouble to get a copy of a document that, as far as Priya knew, Adrian himself had never seen. She spent the next 4 days trying to decide what to do with what she knew, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you're afraid of what's underneath. She thought about going to Adrian directly, and each time she pictured his face, a man already so guarded about his father's memory, she lost her nerve, certain he would think she'd been snooping through his fiancée's private things out of spite, or worse, that he would simply refuse to believe her at all. She thought about confronting Celine, and dismissed it just as quickly. A woman capable of what Priya suspected would have no trouble destroying a maid's credibility and her livelihood in the same breath. 2 days before the wedding, she almost got her answer without asking for it. She overheard Celine on the phone again, this time with a different edge to her voice, something closer to panic than calculation. If he finds out before the wedding, I lose everything. If he finds out after, I'm his wife. Do you understand the difference? I need 48 hours. Priya understood finally what she was looking at. Not love. Not even greed in the simple sense. A calculated bet that whatever truth that document contained would matter less once a marriage certificate existed to complicate it. Celine wasn't trying to hide the document from Adrian forever. She was trying to make sure he didn't see it until it was too late to change his mind. The wedding morning arrived with a kind of blinding, oblivious beauty that weddings always seem to have regardless of what's happening beneath the surface of them. String lights, white roses, 200 people arriving in their best clothes to witness a happiness that Priya alone in that entire glittering crowd knew might be built on something false. She dressed the bride's attendants. She helped pin the veil. She stood 2 feet from Celine in the dressing room and watched her check her reflection with the calm satisfaction of someone who believes she has already won. And Priya thought, not for the first time, about walking away. Doing her job. Letting adults make their own choices and consequences. She thought about Walter Cole's reading glasses on a nightstand no one slept beside anymore. She thought about a 9-year-old boy in a photograph, holding a fishing rod, long before he learned to guard himself against everyone. And she made a decision that had nothing to do with keeping her job. She found the copy of the document one final time in the dress itself. Celine had taped it beneath the boning of the bodice that morning, Priya realized later, planning to produce it herself at some private moment after the ceremony, once the marriage was already secure, once the timing would work entirely in her favor. Priya had seen her slip something flat against her body while adjusting the gown and assumed it was nerves. It wasn't nerves. It was insurance. Priya didn't plan what happened next. She would tell people later when they asked, that she simply couldn't stand at the back of that ballroom and watch a man marry a lie. When Celine reached the 3rd step of the aisle, veil catching the afternoon light, Priya crossed the room before her own fear could stop her. And she tore the seam of the bodice open in front of everyone, because it was the only way she knew to make sure the truth arrived before the vows did instead of after. The folded paper fell into the aisle. Adrian bent and picked it up himself, and the ballroom, 200 guests strong, went silent enough to hear the paper unfold in his hands. He read it standing at his own altar, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress, and Priya watched his face change the way a sky changes before a storm. Slow at first and then all at once. He read it twice. He looked up, not at Priya, but at Celine, and his voice when it came was quieter than anyone in that room expected. "This is my father's amendment. The one his lawyer mentioned after the funeral and then said couldn't be located." He looked down at the paper again. "You had a copy of this. Before we were even engaged." Celine's composure, built over a year of careful performance, finally cracked. "Adrian, I can explain. Explain why you needed a copy of my father's amendment taped to your body on our wedding day," Adrian said. "Or explain why, 3 weeks before I proposed, you were already asking my staff whether my father left anything unusual in his estate." Celine turned toward Priya with a fury that had clearly been waiting a long time to surface. "You've been spying on me since the day I walked into this house." "I've been doing my job since the day I walked into this house," Priya said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. "Your job was supposed to be marrying him, not managing what he was allowed to know before you did." It took Adrian the better part of an hour, once the guests had been asked to wait in the reception hall and the wedding coordinator had quietly begun explaining to caterers that lunch would be delayed, to get the full truth out of Celine. And even then he had to piece some of it together himself from the document and from a lawyer he called directly from the dressing room, still in his tuxedo, veins standing out in his neck in a way Priya had never once seen in 3 years of watching him hide. Every emotion he had. The amendment, it turned out, was real, and it was exactly what it appeared to be. 6 months before his death, Walter Cole had quietly added a clause to his estate naming a second beneficiary. Not a mistress, not a hidden child, as Adrian's lawyer had feared aloud on the phone, but a scholarship endowment in the name of a young engineer who had once saved Walter's company from a catastrophic failure, and been let go without proper credit years before Adrian ever took over. Walter, in his final year, had been trying quietly to correct an old wrong, funneling a modest but real percentage of the estate into an endowment that would carry that engineer's name long after everyone in the family was gone. It changed nothing about Adrian's inheritance in any way that threatened his control of the company. It was, in the end, a small act of conscience from a dying man, buried by a distracted lawyer's office and never properly filed with the rest of the will. But Celine hadn't known any of that when she went looking for it. A distant contact of hers, someone who had briefly done bookkeeping for Walter Cole's company years earlier and remembered vague rumors of a second name in the will, had told her enough to make her believe, wrongly, that there might be another child, another claim, something that could someday threaten the fortune she was marrying into. She hadn't wanted to expose it to protect Adrian's family history. She had wanted it in her possession so that if it ever surfaced after the wedding, she could produce it herself, position herself as the loyal wife who'd protected her husband from a threat, and quietly ensure any settlement moved through channels she could influence. She had gambled that Adrian would rather thank her for handling it than ask why she'd gone looking for it before he'd even proposed. It wasn't a scandal in the way 200 wedding guests, whispering behind their champagne glasses, had assumed. It was smaller and, in its way, sadder. A woman who had never loved the man so much as the uncertainty around what he might someday lose, hedging a bet on a marriage the way you'd hedge a bad investment. Adrian didn't shout. That, more than anything, was what stayed with Priya afterward. How quietly a person's whole future could end. He simply told Celine in front of the wedding coordinator, the caterer, and the 2 lawyers who had by then arrived, that the wedding was over, and that she should be gone from the estate by evening. She left in the car that had been meant to take them both to their honeymoon, alone, still in pieces of a dress that would never be worn again. The guests were sent home with confused apologies and full plates of food no one had the heart to eat. The flowers stayed up for 3 more days because no one thought to take them down, wilting slowly in a ballroom that had gone back to being just a room. Adrian found Priya that evening in the kitchen, still in her uniform, boxing up leftover food for the staff to take home because it seemed wrong to let it go to waste. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. "You could have told me weeks ago," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded, if anything, like a genuine question. "How do you carry something like that alone?" "I tried," Priya said. "I stood in your study with it on the tip of my tongue, and you told me you missed your father, and I didn't have the heart to hand you something that would make that worse before I was sure. You tore my father's amendment out of my fiancé's wedding dress in front of 200 people," Adrian said. "That's a strange kind of not having the heart. I didn't know another way to make sure you saw it before it was too late to matter," Priya said. "I'm sorry about the dress." Something in Adrian's face, exhausted and wrecked as it was, moved close to a smile. "I think," he said, "the dress can be forgiven." In the weeks that followed, Adrian had the amendment properly filed with the estate, and the scholarship his father had quietly tried to fund 6 months before his death was finally established in full. The engineer it honored, now in his 60s, was tracked down and informed by Adrian personally that his old company had never forgotten what he'd done for it, even if it had taken 7 years and a cancelled wedding to make it right. Adrian visited the study on the 2nd floor more often after that, not because grief had lifted, but because he finally understood a little more clearly the man his father had actually been. Someone who tried, however late, however imperfectly, to correct the things that weighed on him. He didn't fire Priya. He tried twice to give her a raise so large she had to ask him to reconsider it, and both times she refused until he settled on something she'd accept without feeling like it was a payoff for silence rather than 3 years of honest work. What changed more than her salary was the way he spoke to her, not as staff he barely registered, but as the one person in that house who had watched him closely enough and cared enough to risk everything she had for a truth he hadn't even known he was missing. Months later, at a small gathering to formally launch the scholarship in his father's name, Adrian asked Priya to stand beside him for the photograph, in front of the framed picture of Walter Cole they'd hung near the study door, the same photo Priya had dusted around for 3 years without ever being allowed to ask about it. She still remembered standing there, the exact weight of that folded document in her hands the day she found it, the fear of what she might be about to lose. What she hadn't expected in the end was what she gained instead. Not a fortune, not a headline, but the quiet, hard-earned trust of a man who finally understood that the people who see the most in a house are often the ones nobody thinks to ask. If you were standing in that ballroom the moment the dress tore, would you have believed Priya, or would you have thought, like most of the guests did in that first shocked second, that she'd lost her mind? Tell us in the comments what you would have done in her place. And if you believe the truth is always worth the risk it takes to tell it, even when it costs you everything to say it out loud, subscribe, like this story, and share it with someone who still believes in people brave enough to speak up when it matters most.